What's up, everybody? So now we are back and we are moving on to Sam Curry, aka ZLZ. And this is the talk I'm looking forward to. We said at the beginning of the stream, hacking games, that sounds really cool. Plus, he's a Tesla owner and he contributed to VerseCon when we were taking donations. So I'm just an all around big fan of Sam, and I'm actually really excited to see what he's got here. So without further ado, please welcome Sam Curry.
Hello and welcome to Owning Online Games with Only Web Hacking Experience. This talk is pretty much aimed towards people with maybe a web hacking background who are interested in game hacking. And it's going to go over, pretty introductory stuff with game hacking and then also go over a few examples of game hacking findings. The targets today we all had pretty explicit permission to test for, but right now there's actually a few bug bounty programs that have games as assets, and examples, like Valve and Rockstar Games. So I think it'll be definitely an interesting thing to explore over the next couple of years with, maybe getting a solid background in game hacking if you're going to be spending time on these bug bounty platforms. All right, so to get started, just a quick who am I? My name's Sam Curry. I've been doing bug bounty for the last 3 years, and I also run like a blog for a lot of like security findings or things that I've found interesting relative to bug bounty and application security. What's not mentioned on here is game hacking is actually how I got into web hacking. And I think both of them feel very similar. There's the exact same rewards and, like rush when you find like a game hacking bug versus a web hacking bug. And some of the reasons for this talk, I think game hacking is one of the really seriously fun things in security. Video games are fantastic. Video games are super fun. I think there's a huge number of people who play like Counter-Strike, League of Legends, and a bunch of stuff in the security community. And in order to mess around with those is just like is a really big rush for a lot of people. You have this very immediate gratification of findings. Like, let's say you're playing League of Legends and you find some bug where you can become invincible. Obviously, it's gonna be like a lot of fun. Who wouldn't mess around with that a little bit? And secondly, I think the barrier of entry for learning game hacking is really really high, or at least it's niche. There's a lot of low level experience required for game hacking, and it's not typically seen. The expected skill set that you would see if you search, on YouTube, how to get into game hacking or how to start game hacking. It's always going to be like low level stuff. And I think that a talk, that explores the similarities between web hacking and game hacking would be kind of beneficial for people who are interested. And of course, lastly, lots of people with only web security background. It's not really common to see people who are actively in both fields. You have people who do low level stuff and web stuff all day, or at least people who are experts in both. So I think that having a strong, web and game thing would be an interesting way to approach this. Right now, if you were to go out and try to start game hacking, there's a few things, there's a few major things that you would have, explicit permission to hack on these bug bounty platforms, or if you were just kind of curious where you could like have permission and go report these findings. And some of those examples are the big major platforms like Valve, Rockstar Games, and of course like the platforms like Microsoft and with these consoles and stuff. But secondly, there's not really a lot, in the vast majority of video games that accept security submissions. Mostly you're going to see like let's say you accidentally find a vulnerability in a game, or you find some sort of bug. You'll have some sort of forum bug submission portal, and that's about it. And that's pretty much the only way if you were to like ethically try to be hacking these multiplayer games, to have permission and protection from these platforms. That's just kind of the current standings right now. And to begin, really, where do you start? If you were to go and download some game off Steam and you're to start hacking it, some of the things you could really start messing with is just proxying for HTTP requests. Believe it or not, there's a huge number of games that are dependent on web servers and are sending HTTP requests back and forth while you're playing, and it's actually a huge dependence. You'll start seeing that there's like so many games that have these really complicated APIs and things like that, and it's not actually some low level TCP/IP like really raw communication that you'll have to like intercept and do like really crazy obstacle course in order to modify and repeat. Second thing you can really test for is like HTML and tag injection. I think moving forward, dependence on browsers and dependence on browser type interfaces is going to be really high. Already, League of Legends, PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, they all have clients that are mostly in HTML5, which is really, really interesting. Or I shouldn't necessarily say mostly in HTML5, but portions of it like login, registration, and pages that you can open in game and things like that that are really interesting because obviously, if there's a browser in a video game, if it's not Chromium or something similar, it's going to be probably some really hacky browser. So you're going to see like a lot of cross-site scripting to RCE type bugs. And lastly, leak secrets. This is a huge one for game hacking right now because dependence on these third-party platforms like Valve, they're going to be passing around these API keys to talk to one another, and compromising one of those would be a pretty major way to do, have a finding on a video game. Lastly, one of the great things about video games is like it feels very similar to a website. If you were to go to yahoo.com and start playing around with the functionality, you've got login, registration, and like all these particular functionalities of search and these different key logic things to mess with. And for the same is kind of true with video games where you go and you have all these different functionalities. You say, okay, I've been dropped into PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds. I can shoot my gun, I can reload it, I can walk. All these things have potential implications like with other players and things like that. So I think exploring in-game logic is a very interesting one. And kind of here on the slide I've listed like a lot of examples of just thought processes in order to find bugs. For instance, can I auction an item for a negative amount of money? You've got financial stuff with that. You can just create money out of nothing. Oh, and I skipped the first one. The first one is what would happen to your items if you traded two players at once? If you're able to open like a trade interface with two players, is there any sort of logic that you could abuse in order to dupe or spawn items? Thirdly, is there an action I could execute to force a teleport? Now, this would be really interesting. Like, let's say there's a mini game on a game where you can smuggle some sort of effect that your character could take outside that mini game. Just like a lot of really, really interesting logic there. And lastly, like something like, are there any in-game processes that can make more efficient a break entirely? This one's really cool. Something like safe spotting, where you're fighting an NPC for drops, and you can stand in a particular area that the NPC isn't able to attack you back, but you're able to attack the NPC. Things like that are just really, really interesting to explore and have like a really fun time with these like thought processes where you're trying to find some sort of area where you can have a little bit or a lot of effect that you're not supposed to. So just really interesting things to explore there. And I guess to get into the first one, one of the games we tested, this was me, Donut, and X Healy, and I'll link them in the talk. But we spent a lot of time playing Rust, mostly just for fun. But when we played this game, we obviously were thinking about ways we could manipulate a little bit or have fun, just messing around. And what we would do is just try mess with these things. And here's just like a little bit of background about the game. And what's really interesting about that bottom picture, that screenshot, there's a bug that was found in the past where, in Rust it's like a multiplayer game where everybody builds bases and stuff. Somebody found a bug where you could type in 3 zeros and a code lock where you open someone's door to their base. And if you hit the clear button and then lastly the last zero and clear at the same time, you could open anybody's doors. So there's this whole chaos in the game where players were going around raiding each other's bases, and it was just crazy. But this is just one example of like a really big finding in a video game that has like a lot of effect on the whole game community and the game itself. Here's just like an example of something we found initially in Rust was, and that's obviously very, very, very similar to it is web application security, but Steam doesn't really care about your username. You can have special characters and whatnot. So what we would do is just throw in like an XSS tag and join Rust servers, and you'd see like a bunch of random things fire. There's a lot of third-party dependence on things like these Rust sites where you have bans or you have different things like that. But the way it works is very similar to blind XSS, but it's just one of the first things. And here's the second thing is literally like a management console where you have all the player logs, the chat logs, and everything like that, and we're able to fire it in here and essentially gain administrative access to the server. And here's like a third one where it's the exact same thing. You've got like metrics for the game, like an Archon console and stuff where you can do management. And basically, there's just tons and tons of these third-party dependent things where you'll have blind XSS. And then lastly is a really, really interesting thing that we're messing with. There's this thing called TextMesh Pro that Rust uses where it's essentially like HTML and tag stuff. And the way it works is you can throw in, very simple tags like bold, link, no parse, align, and you can use it in game, or in the client where it'll render text specifically towards that. And one of the things we noticed was there's also this vulnerability of buffer overflow or stack overflow, where if you just had two breaks next to each other, and this was actually found on the forums. Somebody just reported this in like a common place, and we were kind of curious about this because if we were able to get this injected anywhere in game that another player could see, we could just crash their game. So we started looking around a little bit, and we noticed that if we did size equals 1 for our player, for our username on Steam, whenever we died, we wouldn't be able to see our username where it typically is. So kind of to explore this further, we found that you're able to set this value for a sleeping bag, which you can give to another player. And when you give that value, or when you give that sleeping bag to another player with the modified text, whenever they would die, they wouldn't be able to respawn as their game would crash because it would pop up. And this was like super, super, super interesting because with the dynamic of Rust, like individual players are super important. Typically, it'll be like a clan versus another clan, and if you're able to like, let's say, like, obviously we didn't do this, but like, be able to permanently crash the games of like 3 other players, you could take over their base and it would just change the whole dynamic of the game, where you can like pretty much do whatever you want. But just like a really interesting finding that could have had a lot of impact on Rust if somebody had found it. But we went ahead and reported this, and they patched it pretty promptly. I think it was the next day. Lastly, like, again, these bugs have been patched, but could have pretty much been used to permanently deny someone access to a server. And something similar we found was actually in MineNight, where you could do similar tag injection, but it was a different engine, where you could do color equals white and do these like kind of fun modifications. Lastly, though, most of the time there's like tag injection, it's unexploitable beyond like UI bugs, where it's just kind of a nuisance to another player, but just kind of a fun thing to explore. And kind of the second game that I specifically spent a lot of time on was this game called Black Desert Online. And a lot of the interesting things with this game is that there's this thing called coherent UI, which is used to like display endgame browsers and display the UI. And one of the cool things for coherent UI is it's kind of a solution for, it's like, hey, do you want to display like an HTML file, but you also want to have that HTML file be able to interact with a game. So like, let's say you have an interface that pops up where you click like a submit form button. You can actually call with JavaScript the actual application. So there's a lot of really interesting things there, So if you have cross-site scripting, there's a lot more that you could do, and it turns into a lot of a bigger issue. If you notice here, this left interface is actually an in-game interface where you send an HTTP request, you get an HTTP response, and then in your game you can just play this game in the bottom left corner of your screen. And there's a lot of really similar things that I started noticing with this game. Oh, and back to Coherent UI. Here's just an example of their documentation for their JavaScripts and the way their JavaScript event handlers work. They have a lot of functionality for if you were to create some sort of C++ function, you could actually invoke it with JavaScript. So you can create these specific bindings. Out of the box, you can't necessarily call or like do arbitrary C++, but with the way this works, if the game did some sort of C++ handler which was vulnerable or took in input, then we could call this and fuzz it a little bit. Now this one was really interesting. There's actually a downtime for Black Desert Online, and I noticed that there was a 504 gateway timeout in one of the interfaces. So here you can see just like my guild page, and in the bottom right corner there's just like this error page where it says 504 gateway timeout, and that was actually a HTTP response that failed, obviously. But it's really interesting because it just kind of indicated like there's a lot more web stuff used in this game. And I started intercepting and messing with all these HTTP requests, and there's probably about 100 of them, and just started looking around for something interesting, and eventually found this really interesting guild update request where you can, update your guild information with like an image or like change the bio or whatever. So I started looking for XSS and was really curious, what the implications of XSS actually would be. And I went ahead and found this, and what it is just standard cross-site scripting. So you throw in image source equals google.com favicon, and then you just have that on load event handler. And we're able to do an alert prompt, and it was really cool seeing this alert prompt because it's obviously not a standard alert prompt. You get the nice little border and notice and stuff. And after I got this XSS, I started fuzzing around a lot more, and was able to notice that you could literally just read the contents of files via an XML HTTP request to, file URI and then a drive, and you could enumerate the files and pull the information. This is really cool that you could actually view the directories because, a lot of the limitations here would be like, whoa, cool, you can read arbitrary files, but you don't know the names of the files. So if you wanted to, you could create like a really simple script where if a victim browsed your page, you could just steal their files. So this is a really cool finding. And obviously, like at this point, it's like, how do we get RCE, right? You have local file read, and it's really interesting or whatever, but like you feel so close to RCE, so I just started dumping tons and tons of time in here. And one of the things I was really curious about was what sort of event handlers do they have, and how could I find these event handlers? So I spent time looking around for these a lot, and I eventually found this page right here where you've got this like in-game pop-up, and this was typically shown in game, but I just opened it in the browser for simplification. But in the source of this page was very sadly this engine call to client do Lua. So this was like a arbitrarily defined, by Black Desert Online C++ event handler where we could pass in arbitrary Lua, right? And we could just call whatever we wanted with this to client do Lua event handler. And then what we could pass in here is just this very, very nice os.execute, cmdxe/c ping, and just execute arbitrary commands. And this was really, really cool because with the way the guild management worked, you could essentially worm this RCE against the entire game, against every guild page, via just executing some Lua functions in order to update the victim's guild page. And you could have this nice, very, very terrible worm on this game. And here's just a quick video demonstration of a nice little page that I made to demonstrate this, where, obviously you don't have to click these, but here you've got running Lua without output, running Lua with in-game output, and just, running Windows commands. And then lastly, you've got that, directory listing. The second one's actually really cool, the fact that you can run arbitrary Lua, because let's say you were able to do this, but you weren't able to get, or let's say if it was self RCE, this would be really cool because you could literally write a bot within the game, doing in-game stuff that wouldn't be detected by a lot of standard anti-cheat methods. A lot of stuff would check like, okay, is the user, like modifying anything? Are they running any third-party applications which are suspicious? But if you're able to RCE this or XSS this to run Lua script, you could just write a bot, on your own HTML thing and run it in game, and it wouldn't detect anything weird happening outside of, maybe the actions that are actually executed. As Lua lets you invoke, like standard in-game stuff like walking and doing actions and things like that. So it'd been like a really cool thing if, we didn't have RC against every other player. Another really interesting bonus here is that when we load that favicon.ico, in their fur there's this user number and cert key. And this cert key is just like a secret the user uses to authenticate. And what's really interesting is we can just compromise the account via stealing their fur if we just wanted to have an arbitrary defined image, or if the XSS was patched. And now, like, you have RCE against every player, but it's like, is there anything we could do to get rich in the game? This was just kind of like looking around for fun, another finding to mess with. And one of the really cool things is they have this thing called Cacao Cash, where, you spend in real life money and you get in-game money, which is debatable in the game community of whether or not that should be accepted. But in this game, there is definitely a little bit of pay to win. Some really cool stuff is that this is processed through something called payment wall, where you buy something and you get it goes through like a third party, and there's communication between Black Desert Online, yourself, and payment wall. And once it's confirmed, you'll go ahead and get the in-game stuff. So spent a lot of time in trying to figure out something cool to do with payment wall. And the flow basically worked like this. The user would initiate a transaction on Black Desert Online. It would go to payment wall, and it would be signed by Black Desert Online using a secret key that was not available to the client. And once it signed all the parameters that was set up on the website, it would redirect you to payment wall in order to do that. So what's really interesting is that if you're able to compromise that secret key, or if you're able to do some sort of weird hacky thing to add extra parameters, you could arbitrarily define like an amount or what product you're buying, or change things. So a lot of really cool room here to just play around with, especially that it's like an automatic transaction. What really, and I apologize for all the content on the slide, But the solution we found in order to hack this was if we change the normal GET request to a put request for purchasing it that had, if we go back a little bit, had all these parameters, and we duplicated all the parameters in the put body as well as the GET body, what it would do is it would process the request as a put request, but with the way the application worked, it would check, it would do some sort of equivalent of PHP's global parameters where it doesn't care if it's get, put, post, or whatever. It just sees if a parameter exists. And it did this for verifying that the string and all the parameters were correct. But secondarily, it only checked the get parameters in order to determine the actual logic of the application. So by sending the put request with the correct parameters in the body in the body of the put request, we could actually arbitrarily modify the get parameters to whatever we wanted to, because it would say, okay, what's the body of the put request? Okay, this all makes sense. It's all cryptographically signed, and it's good to go. And then for the actual logic of the payment wall, what it would do, it would check the get parameters, and it'd say, okay, the amount is this price, and we'll go ahead and move forward. And you could just define this to whatever you want, and that basically ends up with lots and lots of endgame items for completely free. And something kind of weird that happened here was when I did this, I was maybe did a little too much for items, and I had a support person reach out to me and say, we're noticing some weird stuff for your account. There's over $2 million in purchases, and I guess that's not really normal for the game. So they wanted to speak to me about it to make sure that everything was going okay. But yeah, just a summary for that. There's a lot of reliance on like web stuff for video games, and like there's a lot of similar logic behind video games and web hacking. So, I think one of the biggest things I see for the game hacking stuff is people say, well, I want to start hacking games, or I'm curious about hacking games, but I only have this limited amount of experience or this specific skill set, and they're kind of turned off by the idea of learning this whole new thing. So they'll spend time trying to figure out something that is pretty complicated, like low-level stuff, and they won't really have a fun time learning game hacking. So I think pairing the two together of game hacking, web hacking is probably a really great thing to do for most people who would be interested in game hacking. And I think that in order to approach it this way, people with web hacking experiences would probably have a lot easier time trying to figure this stuff out. And lastly, I think that with the way everything's moving, I think games are probably on the fast track to have bug bounty programs, and I think that right now there's kind of a niche community or a larger community that's outside of bug bounty of people who have game hacking experience, but not necessarily bug bounty experience. I think in order to kind of fill that demand that'll be coming in the next few years, it'd be cool if more people got into game hacking stuff, and we're actually seeing a lot of movement towards that. There's actually a launch of a platform called Cyrex, which is a game bug bounty platform that'll be interesting to see where it goes. And I just think that not really on the slide, but I think it's probably one of the funnest realms of security, especially for people who love video games. But yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out on Twitter. It's at SamWCYO or SAMWCYO. Just shoot me a DM or anything if there's anything you're curious about or interested in, or that I needed to or didn't do a good job of explaining. But thanks so much, and I hope you guys have a good rest of the conference. Cheers.